Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Mount Washington Valley Economic Council, we welcome you to the third of our 3 debates this October. I don't know how appropriate it is that it's Halloween, but happy Halloween as well. First, I just want to thank our sponsors. The New Hampshire Electric Co-op, as those of you who are regulars know, underwrites the cost of eggs and issues, so we can have a variety of speakers all year long to help educate our small businesses. The sponsor for our gifts for years has been Glass Graphics, and they generously continue to provide our gifts. And then the Economic Council as a whole has 3 main sponsors: the Glenn Group, the Bank of New Hampshire, and HEB Engineering. I also want to thank our timekeeper. Alan, would you stand up and take a bow? He has been our timekeeper for many of our debates, and we all find it very helpful that he's willing to do that. The high school students we used before often lost track of time, so they proved to be less helpful than our numbers guy. I also just want to say that we really appreciate George's willingness to continue his role as moderator. Many of you know George as the moderator of the town of Madison. He also is the owner, developer of the software company Echo that hires and pays good wages here in the Valley. And as I love to say, he's also continuing to be an effective basketball player. So, wow. With that, we'll give it to George.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Good morning. I'll start by thanking our 2 candidates, Walt Havenstein to my right and Maggie Hassan to my left. I will not be referring to them by their well-earned titles, simply to keep it as even-handed as possible. I really want to thank them for coming. We normally are the warm-up for the WMUR debates, but in this case, WMUR warmed them up for us, so we get them at their absolute finest and most ready. I'm going to get right into it. I'd only make one observation, which is that the array of questions that you folks have submitted this morning is a much broader array of questions covering a much broader array of topics than I received for the federal elections. The number of different things people want to talk about and hear from these candidates on is really an interesting array, and I'll probably ask for some more 30-second kinds of responses in order to try and get through more of them. Some of them are pretty far out there, so and so we'll see how you do with those. We did have a coin flip at the beginning, and Walt Havenstein won the coin flip. As a result, he will go last in the closing statements. It's his first victory of the season so far. Maggie Hassan then had the choice as far as who went first in the opening statements, and she selected going first. So Maggie Hassan, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, thank you, George, for moderating, and to Walt for being here. And I also want to take a minute to thank Council President Scott McKinnon and Linda Fox Phillips for organizing the debate. And I want to thank all of you for the work that the Council does to support the vibrant business community here in the Mount Washington Valley. Look, New Hampshire faces a clear choice in this election. Do we continue to move forward together, building on our bipartisan efforts to solve long-standing challenges in the Granite State? Or do we go backward to the slash and burn policies of the Bill O'Brien era that hurt our small businesses, our middle-class families, and our economy? Together, we've put our state back on the right track by working with Republicans, Democrats, and independents to help innovative businesses create jobs, expand middle-class opportunity, and move our economy forward. Our unemployment rate is at its lowest since 2008, and the private sector is creating thousands of jobs. But we know that there are families still struggling, and we have more work to do to keep our economy moving in the right direction. I know we can continue to do it in the New Hampshire way, bringing people together to get things done. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
And this is an opportunity for applause. Walt Havenstein, could you take a minute, please?
Sure. Thank you again for including me, inviting me, and Governor Hassan. It's always a delight. This is our 7th debate. I can't wait for 8, 9, and 10. Actually, this is our last debate. 41 years of leadership. 41 years of leadership in the military and the Marines, business, philanthropy, community service is what I want to bring to the corner office to get our economy moving again. Our economy is dead last in New England. Young people are leaving the state, frankly, because they don't have the opportunities that Judy and I had when we came here 15 years ago. Because this is our 7th debate, let me give you a couple interpretations. You're going to hear the term bipartisan, working together, used a lot. I want you to think toxic partisanship, because that's the way Senate Finance Chair Jeannie Foster described the governor. You're going to hear the Koch brothers used a lot. I'm partial to Pepsi, just so you know. And you'll hear Bill O'Brien's name used a lot. Last time I checked, Bill O'Brien is not running for governor. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, please. Walt Havenstein, we're late in the election cycle, and I have a whole bunch of questions about how we can stop the money that's being spent, the toxic partisanship that we do see during the course of the campaigning season and so on. Is there a particular action you as governor believe that the state of New Hampshire should take to rein in money associated with the political season? Please take a minute.
Yeah, I do. And I proposed it, frankly. It's one of my 7 steps, which I call State House steps, to rein in spending, because I committed that no spending, no contributions to my campaign can be above that of the individual donor. I have not accepted PAC contributions beyond the individual donor. I have not accepted, like my opponent, illegal contributions from unions. It is very important, if we're going to set our state right, that we set the example, leadership example. And so I've done just that. I have not taken contributions from anyone beyond the individual limitations of an individual.
Thank you. Maggie Hassan?
Well, thank you for the question. And throughout my career in the Senate, I worked to change and clarify our campaign finance laws in New Hampshire, and I would look forward to working with members of both parties to do that. Just a moment to say that I did accept, in accordance with past practice, what other governors and other candidates have done, a contribution that was a legal contribution. It was delivered a day late, and the Attorney General set a new rule, said that you can't get them delivered a day late, even if they were issued in compliance with the timeline, and so we returned it right away. Now let's talk a little bit about money in politics, because my opponent has indicated that he doesn't like Coke, he likes Pepsi, but in fact he did sign a pledge to the Koch brothers, saying that he would follow their agenda, which includes repealing Medicaid. He has said that he thinks Bill O'Brien did a great job as Speaker, and that he thought Bill O'Brien's budget was a good budget, the budget that cut cigarette taxes while also cutting our university funding by half. So if you hear me refer to them, that's why. I pledge my allegiance to the people of New Hampshire and their priorities, not outside groups that spend an enormous amount of outside money in our state to pursue their political agenda.
Staying on this topic a little bit longer, Maggie Hassan, you've run ads and your campaign has made statements with regard to essentially the failure of Walt Havenstein as the CEO of SAIC, of BAE, and yet those corporations continue to hire him, to promote him, to pay him well. Their board of directors judged him apparently more positively than that. Do you think that's an appropriate and fair set of criticisms?
Well, as you just heard my opponent talk about how important his experience is to the fact that he's running for this job, I think it's really important to look at that experience. And in his last position, the position that he had full control over a company, his company, SAIC, didn't do well. And it wasn't me saying that, it was business observers who wrote that the company struggled under his leadership. As he implemented a strategy, the company shed thousands of jobs, the stock value went down about 30%, and it had to split in two after he left as CEO. It also was found to have committed massive taxpayer fraud, to the tune of $500 million. And it also was found to have overcharged taxpayers in a contract for training first responders. So I think that my opponent's experience and what is referred to by other business observers as a beleaguered company under his leadership is very appropriate, since he says it's that experience that qualifies him to be governor. I don't think we want his kind of experience leading our state.
Walt Havenstein, you've run ads that, despite Maggie Hassan's opposition to a statewide sales or income tax, they've said her actions are going to result in, quote, us being forced to pay a statewide sales or income tax. Do you think that's a fair charge against her?
I think it's absolutely a fair charge. You can sign the pledge, the old pledge, and still commit us to spending in the out years that will lead us to no alternative but to sales or income tax, and that's exactly what the governor has done. And I asked her to sign Pledge 2.0, which would also mean not committing the state to future spending that would force us into a sales or income tax. She hasn't done that. The reason she hasn't done that is she can't sign that, because she has been willing to make those commitments. And in fact, in 2002, she was running for state senate. She ran on an income tax. When she figured out she couldn't get elected, she switched her position. But since then, has supported over 100 new fees and taxes in our state. It's just a matter of time, folks. This is not rocket science. I was a rocket scientist. We know what's down the road if we don't control spending. And I hope you give me a chance to talk to the governor's comments and attacks on my leadership at SAIC.
Well, why don't you each take 30 seconds, starting with Walt Havenstein, to respond to the others' comments.
Back to the matter, Governor Hassan's attacks on me have been refuted by the Associated Press, by Foster's Daily Democrat, completely debunked. And in fact, when I left SAIC, the chairman of the board praised me for our stellar management and leadership. The fact of the matter is, the circumstances she was describing were circumstances that we uncovered while I was the CEO. Faced into them, fixed them, and moved on, and held those responsible accountable. Frankly, that's the kind of leadership we need in the corner office. Accountable, responsible leadership.
Thank you. And Maggie Hassan?
Well, first of all, I oppose an income or sales tax, and I would veto it if it came to my desk. And I think Walt's comments really indicate a lack of understanding about how state government works, how we come together every 2 years to work through our priorities as a people and find ways to invest in them without a sales or an income tax. We balanced the budget without one. We'll continue to do that by working together and finding out how to sort through our priorities. I just also need to respond to what Walt just said. Wednesday night at the MUR debate, Walt flat out denied that he had given a 5% pay increase to the very people who were defrauding taxpayers in this $500 million massive fraud that was uncovered. And then just yesterday, he changed his story. I think you need to be straight with people, Walt.
I will be perfectly straight with you. What I was responding to was the fact that the governor charged me of inaction. Nothing could be farther from the truth. We cooperated with the government investigation, was ongoing, and the actions we took were consistent with that investigation. And when we finished that investigation, we held everyone who is responsible accountable. That's what leaders do.
Walt, I'm going to leave that one at that. In order to bring the warm and fuzziness that the North Country has to this discussion, I'm going to ask Walt Havenstein, what's the favorite piece of art you have in your home? Describe that piece of art.
Well, I got to tell you, the favorite piece of art that Judy and I have in our home is a painting that sits over our bed of a lady on a swing. And we've had that piece of art since we first got in the Marine Corps in 1971. It was the first piece of art we could afford. It's not particularly fancy. It's not by a renowned artist. And in fact, part of it isn't finished. But it's very, very special to Judy and me. And it's been with us for 43 years.
Thank you. Maggie Hassan, your favorite piece of art in your home?
I have two. One is a portrait of my mom painted when she was 6 years old and recovering from the mumps. She was the only child they could get to sit still for long enough to get a portrait painted of. And the other one is a painting by artists from a community called Ballytobin in Ireland. Ballytobin is a Camp Hill community for people who experience disabilities and guests who are more able-bodied who come to work with the people with disabilities. And there is a wonderful, explosive, great, colorful picture of flowers, a huge sunflower, multicolored, by one of the artists who has autism but paints just beautifully. And that's what I get to look at every morning.
Thank you. Boy, that was a good question, right? Thank you. Yeah. We all want to leave here knowing more about the candidates, and I think that does tell us something about our candidates. Thank you. Candidates, Maggie Hassan, at all levels of government are running with a goal of improving our economy, increasing jobs, and increasing the pay associated with jobs, higher quality jobs. What are you going to do that is truly going to make a difference with regard to jobs in New Hampshire? Please take 1 minute.
So since entering office, I've really worked on following the example of the people of New Hampshire who solve problems in their businesses and families every day. Working with business leaders and members of both parties, we've set into action our innovation plan. That innovation plan allowed us to balance a budget without a sales or an income tax, freeze college tuition, double the R&D tax credit to support our innovative businesses, come together with a bipartisan group of legislators to pass a transportation funding plan to fix our roads and bridges, come together to a compromise with a bipartisan group to expand health care for 50,000 of our hardworking Granite Staters. Going forward, we know we have more work to do, but that innovation plan has set the foundation for 21st century growth. And we're seeing our unemployment rate lowest since 2008. It's a full point lower than it was last year. The private sector creating thousands of jobs. Moving forward, we know we have more work to do, but I'm convinced that as long as we continue to work together in the New Hampshire way, reaching bipartisan coalitions, we'll have a great opportunity to do that.
Thank you. And I will suggest, and probably both candidates, just stand a half step back further from your microphones. I think you're getting some feedback, is that right? Back there. Walt Havenstein, what are you going to do specifically that's going to increase the number of jobs, the quality of jobs here in New Hampshire?
I've laid out a very specific plan, walternh.com/plan, that talks about reestablishing the New Hampshire economic advantage. Talks about rolling back taxes. We're third worst business tax environment in the country. Third worst. We've gone from 14th in the country in new business starts to 35th in the country in just the last decade because of the onerous regulations, the unfriendly business climate we have here. We need to fix that. And that's what my plan does. Our economic growth last year was 0.9%. The year before, it was 1.1%. Anemic, what I call walking dead. 1.1 down to 0.9, and the governor seems to think we're going in the right direction. It is not Common Core math, folks. That if we go going in that direction, it won't be long before we're below zero. Below zero. This is not the right direction for our state. We've fallen behind Vermont and Rhode Island in New England, dead last in New England. Vermont. Vermont, excuse me? That's not just unacceptable, that's an embarrassment to all of us.
Thank you. Walt Havenstein, you talk about the high rate of business taxes here in New Hampshire. What specific taxes would you roll back and to what levels?
Business profits tax, highest in the region, makes us uncompetitive when businesses are looking to start and grow here. Currently, 8.5%. We need to take them back to 7.4% in two, and that's what I proposed in my plan, in two increments, to get us to a point where we're once again competitive and leading New England, along with regulations that we need to roll back, but specifically on taxes, starting at business profits tax. Eventually, we want to roll back the BET, right, which is a tax on jobs, right? That's now at 0.75%. Under the Democrats, those have moved up from 6% in the business profits tax and from 0.25% in the BET. That's why we're not competitive. That's why we have 106,000 residents who leave the state every day to commute to work, because we're not creating the jobs here in New Hampshire.
Walt Havenstein, very briefly, what would the loss in revenue be with the reductions you propose?
The loss in revenue would be $90 million, and I proposed a way to recover that. Oh, by the way, balanced budgets aren't about revenue. Balanced budgets are about spending. And I know that because I had a budget of 3 times that of the state of New Hampshire when I was running BAE Systems. Never had $80 million of casino gambling in my budget, I can tell you that. Right? Never failed to meet my budget. And you meet your budget by controlling spending. And that's what we're not doing today.
Well, we'll come back to that, but Maggie Hassan, we do have very high business taxes here in New Hampshire. Any action that you believe is appropriate with regard to those?
Well, I think what's unfortunate is that my opponent picks and chooses data and gives you a partial picture of things. The same group that he cites on the 3rd overall highest business tax says we are the 7th best overall tax climate in the country for businesses. We've been recognized not only as the best state in the country to live by OECD, but we have been recognized as the best state in the country to earn a living in. What makes us uncompetitive is Walt's plan to blow a $90 million hole in our budget for tax giveaways to big business, many of them out-of-state big businesses. We actually do reach efficiency targets in the New Hampshire state budget. My agencies just exceeded their 3.6% efficiency targets and returned more money to the general fund than they were supposed to. So we continue to have this difference here. Are we going to blow a $90 million hole in the budget that takes us right back to the Bill O'Brien budget that cut our university system in half? Or are we going to invest in the very things that businesses tell us they need, like an educated workforce?
4 years ago, 5 years ago, the university system, which both of you have mentioned, was 50th in the country with regard to funding. 4 years ago, the legislature cut in half the level of funding associated with the university system, and in our most recent biennium, we have about 60% of that return. We're still about 17% below where we were 5 years ago. And we are such a distant last place in the entire country in terms of funding for higher education that we'd have to increase 40 or 50% to be tied for 49th. 40 or 50%. That's how far below we are the rest of the country. How can we compete with regard to attracting businesses, particularly technology businesses or high-paying businesses, if we don't have any interest in funding our higher education system?
Well, one of the things that I did as I campaigned to do 2 years ago, and we implemented in our budget, was coming together to find a way to return most of the money that Bill O'Brien and his supporters had cut from the university system. And in exchange for that, we asked the university system to freeze tuition, which they did. Then we also restored the money to the community college system that the last legislature had cut. And they have not only frozen tuition, they cut the university system tuition by 5%. So students at White Mountains Community College or at Lake Regions Community College right now are seeing a 5% reduction in tuition. That's incredibly important for our middle-class families and for our young people and for keeping them here. And one of the things that concerns me is my opponent has praised the Bill O'Brien budget and has said in other interviews he wouldn't increase university funding. I think that's a mistake, because what we know we need more than anything for the 21st century economy is a workforce trained up for those jobs. And the university system and the community college system have making great strides to improve STEM education and align curriculum much more with business needs. And as we do business roundtables and Chamber of Commerce meetings, we're seeing great improvement as we go forward with that kind of investment in our human capital.
Maggie Hassan, 30 more seconds. Do you have any sort of 4 or 8 or 12-year plan that gets New Hampshire up to 49th in the country with regard to funding for higher education, or even 25th?
Well, certainly that's something we need to continue to come together to plan for. But what I know is that as we're freezing tuition, as we're lowering it at the community college, and as we're doing some other innovative things within our higher education system, for instance, a 4-year college degree with an agreement between Granite State College and SNU, the 4-year college degree now costing $10,000, that's the kind of affordability that middle-class families can understand. And similarly, the agreement between the community college and the university system that allows folks to get their 4-year degree with 2 years at community colleges and 2 years at the university system makes it much more affordable. So we'll continue to innovate and we'll continue to plan to make it accessible and affordable for our young people and their families.
Thank you. Walt Havenstein, $90 million coming out of the budget with reductions to business taxes. What are we going to do for the funding of a university system that's so far below any other state in the country? If you believe that's an important factor in...
Of course I believe it's an important factor. Long before the governor was talking about education and higher education, I was doing something about it. 15 years ago, when I got to Sanders, what became BA Systems, I realized that we weren't getting any engineers out of University of New Hampshire system, and specifically at Durham. And I was hiring 150 a year. So I met with the president of the university, Ann Weaver Hart, and along with the dean of the College of Engineering and Physical Sciences, and we sat down and created a plan. Not a talking plan, an action plan. And I invested in UNH. They modified their curriculums in electrical engineering, mechanical engineering, and computer science. Within 2 years, we were interning those students, and within 3 years, we were hiring them. And today, I am very proud to say that more engineers come from UNH to BA Systems than any other school in the country. That's action-oriented leadership, not talking, action-oriented. And I've met with Mark Huddleston over the last decade, time and time again, about putting a strategy forward to make sure that we're making our investments for the future, not for the past. Half of our students, in-state students at UNH, graduate and leave the state. The worst thing about the system is we don't have jobs. We aren't creating a demand mechanism to pull the education in the direction we need it to go. The governor's putting the cart before the horse, frankly.
Thank you. Well, Havenstein, it is true. Half of the students who graduate from our university system leave the state. But part of the reason is because roughly half of the students in our university system are from out of state, and we need them because we need to overcharge them the tuition in order to subsidize the tuition of our in-state students. Why wouldn't that continue to happen until we fund higher education at a competitive level with other states?
Well,
I'm sorry, I'm a former trustee of the university system.
Well, truth and lending here. The reality is I do support funding of the college and the university system here. I do support it. I've supported it for the last 15 years. But what we want to make sure we have is a strategy that integrates education and acts as a conduit to the future employment needs of our state. That's what we don't have. We don't have an economic development plan from the governor. I do. That includes integration of our education. And not just a higher education, K through 12. And as the chairman of board of FIRST Robotics, sponsored over 13 high schools in this state alone, 130 when I was CEO of BA Systems around the country, inspiring young people in STEM education, long before it was popular.
Thank you.
Working with Dean Kamen for the last 20 years on this.
Thank you. The topic of right to work comes up in a number of the questions, and could you describe your position and rationale for, Walt Havenstein, for your support of right to work law here in New Hampshire, particularly given that historically it's been something that's simply been worked out between employers and unions?
Yeah, I support a right to work law, and I do believe the construct between the employers and the employees is worked out through management and employees, however they want it to work. I've worked in right to work states. I've led businesses in right to work states where we had bargaining units because that was the right management employee relationship we wanted. But right to work would set New Hampshire singularly apart from other states in the region, give us an economic advantage when it came to attracting new business to our state. I'll give you one example. Over in Newport, Sturm Ruger, summer ago, decided to add 2 new product lines. But they started with a clean sheet of paper and said, where should we do that? And instead of adding those 2 product lines in New Hampshire, they put them in North Carolina. The first criteria they used was right to work. Right to work. What scares me about that decision is once they get those 2 product lines and those 100 new employees down in North Carolina, what is the fate of the 1,600 employees they have out in Newport? Nobody seems to be thinking about that. It should have been an immediate trigger for economic development to say, what do we have to do to keep those good-paying jobs from leaving our state?
Thank you. Maggie Hassan, could you talk a little bit about your position of right to work and particularly address the issue of forcing employees to pay unions who don't wish to be part of that union?
Well, thank you. I think a better label for that policy is right to work for less, because if you pass so-called right to work legislation, you're saying to businesses who want to pay employees less, please come to New Hampshire. I don't think we want to aspire to be Mississippi. I don't think we want to aspire to be the other states where right to work is enforced, where the wages are lower and the economy is doing worse. I think we want to make sure that we are aligning our workforce development through our community college systems and our university systems with the needs of the 21st century economy, which is what we're doing with our business and education group that is working on its strategy as we speak. What is important to know is that no employee is forced to join a union, and businesses and employees, when they do their collective bargaining, can decide as part of that process whether, in fact, non-union employees are going to be required to pay an agency fee. That's a matter of collective bargaining between employees and business. I don't think government should interfere with that.
Thank you. Maggie Hassan, is there a particular issue that faces this particular part of the state, perhaps but not the rest of the state, that you have a particular position on?
Well, thank you for the question. I was honored to be up here probably about 6 weeks ago or so to do one of our Live Free and Start innovation roundtables over at the Tech Village. Live Free and Start is an initiative that we began in June that really is looking at how we make sure that our regulatory and technological environment in New Hampshire is attractive to entrepreneurs. So we will attract more of them here, we will help more of them stay here, and we will help those who are already here continue to grow and create jobs. One of the things I heard from the wonderful business people and citizens who joined us at that roundtable was that, among other things, housing is a real issue up here. To make sure that we have affordable housing for workers, and that a number of different leaders in this community are working on a regional solution that will balance the effectiveness of leveraging regional strategies with the importance of local control. I think that that's a very important thing. It's something I led on in the state Senate to make sure that communities could have available housing for their workers, and I'll continue to work with folks to improve that.
Thank you. Walt Havenstein, a particular issue that you know affects us up here, perhaps not the rest of the state.
Well, I think aspects of our infrastructure up here are extremely important. In particular, sure, roads and bridges, but also broadband communication. If this part of the state doesn't have access to broadband communication, frankly, and there are places we can go where you can't get your iPhone to work. If we don't have that access, we're not connected. We're not connected to be able to do business. So first and foremost, when I look at infrastructure in the North Country, and here in the Valley in particular, make sure we have a broadband infrastructure. I would also tell you that trained or just workers, employees, enough employees to support the businesses we currently have to grow is a critical issue for us here. And part of that is driven, frankly, by we've incentivized people not to work. Incentivized, and I've heard that time and time again, especially with small businesses. It's hard for them to find folks to come in and work. We need to incentivize people to work.
A particular approach to helping us with regard to broadband access up here, what in particular would we do?
Sure, part of that is the structure we have for incentivizing the private sector to create that capacity up here. And we have the ability to do that. The governor has the ability to lead in making sure that happens. A particular governor hasn't. I will.
For both of you, and I'll start with Walt Havenstein since you were right there.
Sure.
It's simply inefficient and not economically attractive to private enterprise to provide high-speed internet access at competitive prices simply because we don't have the density of population here. Should we be treating broadband access as a utility, and shouldn't we require rates to be the same here and in other rural areas in New Hampshire as they are in Manchester or Portsmouth?
We're going to have to take an approach, probably a hybrid approach, that allows us to do that, because if we don't, frankly, the private sector will continue to balk at that. But they can also be incentivized properly to make that happen, and I intend to do that.
Thank you. Maggie Hassan, turning broadband access into a utility.
Just for a second, let's talk a little bit about the other things that Walt also mentioned, roads and bridges and broadband too. Walt opposed the transportation funding plan that we put into place with a bipartisan coalition that is currently fixing roads and bridges here. You can't blow a $90 million hole in the budget and then say that you're going to continue to fix roads and bridges. You can't want to repeal the bipartisan agreement that we put forth and then still fix roads and bridges. As far as broadband is concerned, we did complete with grants what's called broadband mapping in the state so that we can begin to understand where we need to leverage public-private partnerships in areas like this to extend broadband. Overall, our state gets very high ratings compared to other states with the overall level of broadband connectedness. But in pockets where the last mile is an issue, we still do have work to do, and there's some very interesting public-private opportunities to do that we're currently considering.
Thank you. Let's stay on roads and bridges then for a minute. One of the criticisms of the increase in the gas tax, other than it's an increase in the gas tax, was that a portion of that money, and historically has gone for other than the building of roads and bridges, in particular support for example, the State Police Department. What are your comments with regard to that?
Well, our Constitution is very clear that the highway fund is to be used for the construction and repair of roads and bridges and the supervision of safety thereon. So the Constitution contemplates that you can have nice roads and bridges, but if they're unsafe because people aren't supervised when they're driving on them, that isn't good either. So we came together, Republicans, Democrats, the Business and Industry Association, Chambers of Commerce, to support a transportation funding plan that will give us a modern and solid transportation infrastructure, which our businesses and our commuters need. The cost of repairs has gone sky high for people who drive on some of our worst roads and bridges. So we came together to do that. When my opponent says he would repeal the transportation funding plan that we put together, he says that he would then take money away from the Department of Safety to fund construction. That affects and could possibly take as many as 80% of our state troopers off the roads. That's not safe, that's not appropriate, just after we reinvested in our bipartisan budget to increase the number of state troopers, especially in New Hampshire's rural areas.
Walt Havenstein.
I oppose the gas tax.
Okay. And would you support repeal of it?
I would support repeal. We have to do it in a structured way. Senator Jeb Bradley has put forth a proposal over 4 years to do that. The issue with the gas tax isn't my lack of support for infrastructure. I support it. It is a key part of my economic development plan. I just want to make sure the money that we're collecting from gas taxes and diesel taxes is going to fix our infrastructure, instead of being diverted to other uses that should be taken care of in the general operating fund. The governor says, I'm going to blow a $90 million hole in the budget. What budget? We haven't set a budget. We blow a $90 million hole in the budget is what the governor's done by overspending. By overspending. We overspent $22 million in the last fiscal year. We're forecasting that by the time we get into the next fiscal year, we'll be $100 million overspent. That's how you blow a hole in the budget. You craft budgets that have dependable revenue, just like this budget does, and then you manage your expenses. You manage your spending. That is what we're not doing.
Let's stay on the budget then for a minute. With regard to both the elimination of $90 million in business taxes and the elimination of the gas tax, the gas tax increase, where would the cuts come from the existing state budget that would fund the $100+ million loss of revenue?
My plan assumes no economic growth for a state, not even the pitiful 0.9% that we're currently experiencing. And I've said we can find 2.5% of efficiencies in state government. The governor tried to explain the lapses as a basis of efficiency in state government. It's not. It's a budgeting mechanism. We have absolutely no evidence of getting more done for less. And BAA systems, year after year after year, I had a 3 to 5% target for efficiency gains. We met those targets year after year after year, grew the business, and created jobs. In Nashville alone, we created 1,500 new high-tech, high-paying jobs, high manufacturing content jobs in the 4 years that I was there. In the last 2 years, we've lost 1,500 here in the state. The contrast is very, 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 very clear. I have a plan, and I have the experience because I've actually done it. The governor doesn't have a plan because she wouldn't know how to do it.
Governor, in terms of balancing the budget for the next 2 years going forward, are there additional sources of revenue you'll be pursuing and additional expenditures you'll be looking to make during this next 2 years?
Well, first of all, what a disservice my opponent just did to the hardworking and creative men and women who work for the state of New Hampshire. A workforce that has been depleted significantly since the recession hit in 2008, who served more and more people at the height of that recession with fewer people because they were creative and efficient. So first of all, as my opponent might want to take a little bit of time to learn about New Hampshire state government, he might learn how hard our state employees are working and how creative and efficient they are. He might want to learn how the judicial system has completely revamped with the kind of efficiencies and new technological improvements that have actually made them highly more efficient. The lapse is a 3.6% lapse. My agency has beat that. I would be happy to talk a little bit more about how we did balance a budget without a sales and income tax to a surplus, how our agencies did exceed their efficiency targets, and how the fact that when you balance a budget, yes, you have to make sure you're spending carefully, and all of our spending was approved by bipartisan votes in the legislature. But you also have to watch revenue trends. And tax law changes made by the O'Brien legislature 2 years ago, or 3 years ago now, impacted certain revenue trends. When you make tax law changes, that's going to change your budget dynamic, and you have to be cognizant of that as you make those decisions. We've adjusted to that. We've managed our budget to a surplus. We'll continue to manage our budget to a balance in this fiscal year, and we will come together as a people and make the tough choices to make sure that we are investing in our innovation strategy and plan for economic growth moving forward.
Well, going forward then, for the next 2-year budget, and you're in the planning process for that certainly right now, regardless of who the next governor will be, do you have any plans for any sources of increased revenue, new sources of revenue or increases in existing sources of revenue? And are there any particular areas of focus in terms of increased spending that you think are of greatest importance?
We are in the process of gathering data from our agencies, and we will move forward, and the next governor will present their budget at the end of January or early February. As I think you all know, in addition to making sure that we reach efficiency targets, and in addition to making sure that we constantly review what programs are necessary, what are outdated, what we might change, how we might reduce spending on some lines and increase spending on others to meet the priorities that the people of New Hampshire identify. One of the things that I think is important so that we can keep investing and make sure we balance our budget and have the revenues we need for things like additional funding for deferred and delayed water projects, something that we were able to fund in our last budget, have the funding for new school buildings, is to consider having a single high destination casino in our state. We have people in New Hampshire who leave this state to go to Connecticut and Maine and soon to Massachusetts to use casinos, and those revenues are generated for their schools and their bridges. I think it makes sense with a highly regulated casino to do it here so we can capture those revenues here and invest in our people and our future.
Thank you. Walt Havenstein, in terms of the next budget, the one going forward, the one that is going to have cuts that reduce our revenue significantly that you suggested, can you provide specific cuts that you'd be generating through these efficiencies you've described? What's specifically going to be reductions in spending that will generate $100+ million?
We'll continue to work with the administrators in our state and the state agency heads to find targets for that 2.5% that I identified. And let me tell you something, there's nobody more conscious of the hard work of our state employees than I am. I worked in government for the first 10 years of my career, and I worked with government for virtually the entire rest of my career. I know how hard they work, and I know how diligent they are, and I know what they're capable of doing when it comes to finding ways to provide more service for less money.
Could you
The governor says that our revenue and our taxes made it difficult on the budget side. Our revenue for the last year and for this year are exactly where they were supposed to be. Exactly where they're supposed to be. What's not there is our spending. And when the legislature asked the governor for more transparency in that spending and put forth a bill, she vetoed it. We can't have that. Transparency to all our citizens on the spending side is just as critical as what we're seeing on the revenue side.
George,
yes,
excuse me just a second. Let's talk a little bit about this. Yeah, revenues right now, as of this moment, are just about on target for the overall plan. But what we saw last April was a change in two lines, interest and dividends and business profits, that sank suddenly. And as we evaluated that, we traced it back to those tax law changes I mentioned. So what did we do? We immediately did a preemptive and preventive executive order, unprecedented in state government, to freeze out-of-state travel, hiring, and certain purchasing. Over the summer, we instructed our agencies to defer large purchases. But what we see as we're planning for the remainder of fiscal year 15 and into the future is those trends in those two lines are likely to continue. And if that happens, we are going to need to make cuts, so we're in the process of doing that. It's disingenuous to imply that we haven't controlled spending, and it's unfair and frankly not candid to acknowledge that there is unexpected revenue dips that Ways and Means people in both political parties didn't see coming, and that we are planning and addressing those because that's what you do in state government to responsibly balance your budget without a sales or an income tax.
One more minute on the topic of the coming budget, Walt Havenstein, and if you could sneak in a comment on gambling, that would be helpful since Maggie Hassan snuck in a little comment on gambling.
Be happy to. Let me go back to one point. The governor is right. She signed an executive order to ban travel. 2 weeks later, she took a trip to Turkey. Let me talk to you about leadership. You want to lead faithfully, you lead by example. You want to lead faithfully, you don't take exceptions to your rules that apply to every other state employee for yourself. That's not leadership. When it comes to the casino, I am not in favor of casino gambling for New Hampshire. It's real simple. Casino gambling is a dying market. If you look up and down the East Coast, what used to be a cash cow for New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware is now a tax burden. I am not willing to gamble taxpayers' money, which will necessarily be required, on casino gambling. More importantly, it cannot be the cornerstone of economic development for our state. My economic development doesn't count on one specific industry. It's designed to empower all industries to be more competitive, to start and grow here in our state.
Thank you. Walt Havenstein, what's your favorite video game?
Well, this is going to sound goofy. We used to have a video game when you had a Commodore 64 called Duck Hunt.
Yeah.
That's about as sophisticated as I ever got. I would tell you this, at Sanders, we invented video games. Back in the late 60s, early 70s, you remember the game Pong, the first game? That came from Sanders innovation. That's real innovation, not talked about innovation.
That was a more intense answer than I was looking for. But thank you. Maggie Hassan?
I've been known to play solitaire on my computer. That's about as video as I get.
Okay.
But hey, let's just be a little bit clear, because Walt really does need to be straight with people here. Our executive order on out-of-state travel was to say no more expenditures on out-of-state travel. The trade mission for Turkey had obviously been planned for a long time, because you want to be careful and you want to make sure it's as effective a trade mission for your small businesses as you can possibly make. And so we had already expended the money. It was not refundable. And the 7 businesses that went with us, 7 businesses who had 125 meetings with various Turkish businessmen during that 5 days of active meetings in Turkey, would have been out a trip and out an opportunity, and they wouldn't have gotten their money back either. It's not good leadership to put the burden of those expenses back on small businesses who were relying on that trip and who needed to make it. So I think it's just really important for people to understand that the executive order said no additional new money spent on out-of-state travel, but any state employee for whom the travel had already been purchased was allowed to go.
Maggie Hassan, New Hampshire is one of the large majority of states that has adopted the Common Core, at least as far as the basis for our statewide testing of students in K through 12. The Common Core has also become a political issue. Is the adoption of the Common Core as a central curriculum for English and math a good idea? And is the role of the state in creating a statewide testing system that really drives curriculum in our individual schools an appropriate one?
We know that we need to make sure that our young people are prepared for 21st century jobs. That's why we've come together with the community college and university system and business leaders to make sure that we're strategizing about how we move our higher education forward. It's why we have a STEM education task force for K through 12 meeting as we speak, who will release their recommendations next week to make sure that our young people have an opportunity for deeper hands-on learning in the classroom. And the career and college readiness standards that school districts throughout New Hampshire are implementing include Common Core because it has those elements in it. Now, it's very important that Common Core be implemented well, and that it be implemented in a way that there aren't high stakes for students and teachers as they begin to implement it. And that's what we're doing in New Hampshire, which has distinguished us from other states as they implement it. More than anything, what I hear from businesses is that they want us to make sure that we are supporting and investing in education from pre-K all the way up through higher education and innovating in that space, and that's what we're doing.
Thank you. Walt Havenstein, your perspective on the rollout of the Common Core here in New Hampshire.
I oppose Common Core. So let's make sure we're clear about that. I do not believe a one-size-fits-all agenda coming from Washington, D.C. through Concord is the right thing for the people of New Hampshire. You know what we like in New Hampshire? You know what we equate freedom to in New Hampshire? Choice. And choice in education, and choice in making the decisions around our children and what they need. And that ought to be done locally between parents and teachers in setting the curriculum that they think is appropriate for their children. You know, one of the things about these Washington-based or Concord-based solutions in education, we're testing our kids too much. I have a 5-year-old granddaughter, 5 years old, who's worried about getting tested. She ought to be not worried at all. She ought to be learning. And we ought to have parents who can understand how to do math. Not Common Core math, but just 5 pennies separated in a group of 2 and 3. That equals 5. 2 plus 3 equals 5. They can't do that. They're frustrated. They're frustrated. Why? Because of Common Core.
So if I have no Concord-driven standards associated with education, I'm therefore unable to compare how my local school is doing against other schools in the state and across the country and internationally. How would you, is that important or does that not matter? Should I just
I'm
be
a firm
focused
believer
locally?
in standards, and I'm a firm believer in accountability. As long as the standards are aspirational, and as long as the accountability is tracked and is formed as the basis for getting better. What we don't have, frankly, we do have standards. We have NECAP standards. We have a variety of standards that we could choose from. And frankly, that's what I want our schools to be able to do. Find out what is best for them, right?
But if every school is choosing which is best for them, how do I compare myself to other schools?
The schools will figure that out. I hate to tell you that. They actually will determine how they want to compare themselves with other school districts. They've done it for years. The problem is when we set a standard, frankly, a standard that's complicated and too low, right? We do not achieve the aspirational goals that we should be setting for our young people. The governor talks about committees or councils or whatever it is on high-tech. Look, I've been doing high-tech education for 25 years, not talking about it, doing it. And today, on the first program alone, where I was chairman of the board for 4 years, 400,000 U.S. kids are participating in that program. Didn't require any state funding. 180,000 volunteers. Didn't require any state funding. What required was inspiration, all right? And a plan and a motivation to make that plan work.
George, if I might.
Well, let me ask the question a little bit. Maggie Hassan, why should Manchester be required to follow the testing requirements associated with Common Core when, in fact, they want to vary their curriculum and, from their perspective, make it a more challenging, more interesting? Why should that be dictated from Concord?
Well, first of all, let's be clear that my opponent has in the past supported Common Core, and then as he decided to run for governor, he's abandoned that support. And that's a system that, of course, was developed by businesses and states together, state by state, and then joined in a national decision among the states to use the Common Core curriculum. Manchester has its own curriculum, but the fact of the matter is that the state spends money on local education, and if my opponent were to go forward with his plan to blow the hole in the $90 million hole for big businesses, there will be less state aid for local schools. There go your property taxes. But the fact of the matter is that you then do need to find a way to measure how your education system is doing to make sure you're holding everybody accountable. Finally, I'll say this. Sometimes it is hard when your child comes home from school and has work that you don't fully understand. But I think we all want more for our children than we had ourselves. I think that's the core of who we are as Granite Staters and as Americans. And if it's a challenge for me to understand some of my children's curriculum, that's okay because it's going to better prepare them for the 21st century workforce.
Thank you. Maggie Hassan, speaking of us here in New Hampshire, what was your worst college grade and what course was it in?
Okay, I did not do well in chemistry. I passed the lab but had difficulty with the classwork the first time through, so I took it over again and I passed.
Very good. All right. Walt Havenstein? If you can't remember, that's going to tell us something.
I got a D in modern English literature. Remember, I was an aerospace engineering major. I actually got an A in chemistry, by the way. So I knew what STEM was a long time before it was being popular. But I wasn't too keen on reading Beowulf and things like that, Canterbury Tales and the like.
What was your major, Maggie Hassan?
Well, I started...
No, this is a short answer question.
No, I had two. Okay. I started as pre-med and history. My grandfather was a doctor who I admired very, very much and did a lot of science as well as other courses. And then I decided over time to just pursue history and then law.
Thank you. Okay, history and law. Walt Havenstein, let's talk about Medicaid expansion a little bit. Could you talk about, in particular, your opposition to the Medicaid expansion that has passed, whether you opposed it, or do you accept the wording of the law that did pass that has the sunset provision, number one? And number two, what would you say to people who could conceivably lose that coverage if the state does allow that to sunset?
Yeah. So I'm perfectly clear. I'm opposed to Medicaid expansion. I would not have signed the law that was signed for a couple reasons. Primarily because it is sunset. It makes a commitment for only 2.5 years. 2.5 years. It's Lucy and the football and Charlie Brown. 2.5 years from now, there's Lucy with the football in the form of 20,000 of our Granite Staters on a program that could be pulled right away from them. And I know that we get a chance to budget and allocate and change those laws. But the fact is, you should never sign a law that has that kind of provision in it. And why do we have that kind of provision? Because it's left unbounded the way the governor had proposed it. We have no way to pay for it, except a sales or income tax. That's the point I was making about driving us to a sales and income tax. Right? We've got to fix it. And that's why I said since the day one, we have to fix it. We have to fix it for those who are now receiving that benefit so it is sustainable in a way that we can afford. But we shouldn't be taking victory laps every time we add another person to a government program. We should be creating an environment where they are less dependent on our government programs. Safety net for sure, but it ought to act as a trampoline, not a hammock.
Thank you. And would you have signed the law if it did not contain the sunset provision?
Well, it would have to contain something else, right? It would have to have a clear revenue stream to make sure it was sustainable. I would not have signed the law that the governor signed, I can tell you that.
Maggie Hassan, could you comment on your signature of the Medicaid expansion law? And as everyone, I assume in this room knows, the Medicaid expansion applies to individuals who are low income, but whose income isn't low enough for the previous level of Medicaid coverage, and so it expands the number of people who would qualify for Medicaid. If I say it correctly?
Yeah, and thank you. And the reason that members of both political parties and the Business and Industry Association supported Medicaid expansion, which is fully paid for in the first years by the federal government and brings $2.5 billion of economic stimulus into our state as we cover people who need health care, is that we do know that there are about 50,000 hardworking Granite Staters who earn $16,000 or less, who many of them didn't have access to health care. So I think it's important, if we're going to have a productive workforce, we need a healthy workforce, and it's important for our families to have the health and economic security that comes with health care coverage. Now, my opponent is not being straight with all of you. He opposes Medicaid expansion. He signed a pledge to the Koch brothers to repeal it. So when he says he would do something to fix it, he's either not being straight with the Koch brothers or he's not being straight with the people of New Hampshire. He can't have it both ways. I did not support the sunset in 2017, but as part of the compromise to get the bill passed, we agreed to it. And in Concord, every 2 years, we come together to set our budget priorities, to figure out how we're going to use revenues to address them. And I'm confident we'll be able to do that again, because the 50,000 people who will have access will, of course, be getting primary and preventive care, which will give us savings in other parts of the budget.
Thank you. Without getting into the whole Obamacare debate and the federal legislation associated with that, do you support the creation of a New Hampshire-specific website for the management of the health insurance exchange here in New Hampshire?
Well, I think the federal government did a terrible job of rolling out the Affordable Care Act. I was disappointed that the O'Brien legislature blocked the capacity of the New Hampshire of the state of New Hampshire to set up its own website. We weren't allowed to by law, so we now have a partnership website. The predictions were that when the exchange went into effect in New Hampshire, that perhaps 19 or 20,000 people would find insurance on the exchange. In fact, 40,000 people are now using the exchange. And we are building now, we have new healthcare insurance competition coming into the state. So instead of having the one provider who we had last year, which was problematic, we now will have 5 with as many as 60 plans to choose from. And the recent announcements by those insurers by some of those insurers show that on average rates are holding flat or even coming in a little lower. So we are making progress on affordability, and as the Medicaid expansion plan moves into its next year, those people will be shifted from Medicaid onto the private private insurance on the exchange.
Thank you. Walt Havenstein, your thoughts on the creation of a state-specific website for New Hampshire's health insurance exchange?
I'm not in favor of a state-specific website exchange. Certainly, we're all disappointed. For those of us who've worked with the government over the years, federal government, we're not as disappointed as some because we knew this was happening. Frankly, it showed the lack of leadership in Washington, and we're grateful that our legislature did not tie us to our own attempt to try and create an in-state website. You know, what's not being said here is that 22,000 of our citizens lost their health insurance immediately. And more than that, lost their doctors and access to their hospitals. And almost every one of us saw our premiums go up, our deductibles go up. The Affordable Care Act was anything but affordable. And it wasn't focused on care. It was focused on access and insurance. It was as simple as that. It was a restructuring of taxes. What's pending is when this rolls out to businesses later this year, there's an estimated 70,000 more New Hampshire residents, citizens and voters, who are going to lose their health insurance coverage. We can do so much better than that. When I was the CEO of BAE Systems, there was a push to have only one provider at BAE Systems here in New Hampshire. I made sure in 2000 that we kept Harvard Pilgrim in the state. It was the 4,000 employees at BAE Systems would incentivize Charlie Baker to keep Harvard Pilgrim active in the state when the Democrats were driving us from 26 insurers down to 1. Again, choice equals freedom. Choice equals freedom, and frankly, we're losing choice every single day under these Washington dictates.
Given our time, Maggie Hassan, do you want to take another 30 seconds to comment further on health?
Well, a lot of misleading data in Walt's last answer, but I have been working on healthcare for a while because our healthcare system has been unsustainable and our costs too high for a long time. What I know is that we are seeing more competition coming into the market now, partly because of the Medicaid expansion plan we passed, and we're seeing a flattening of rates on average, and that's progress. I also know that I've been thanked by couples who come up to me, middle-aged couples who are self-employed, who said they never had access to health insurance before because they had pre-existing conditions, they were self-employed, and they couldn't afford it. And not only could they not afford it, they were denied it by every carrier. So we have more work to do. The rollout has not been acceptable, and there are inconsistencies in the program that need to be fixed. But to say that we should just throw it out and go back to a time when people who had pre-existing conditions couldn't get coverage, to go back to a time when there were $1 million caps on insurance plans that bankrupted families, that's not acceptable either.
Thank you. Among the highest electric rates in the country, it's obviously a limiting factor for many businesses to expand and to grow, and certainly a burden on our consumers. What are you going to do, and what can you do as a governor with regard to influencing the size of our electric rates, and in particular, any comments you have on Northern Pass would be helpful.
Well, thank you for the question. The rise in costs of energy in New Hampshire and in this part of the country has been a long-standing challenge, and it's one I began to address as soon as I entered office. So we've just released a 10-year an energy strategy, the first one done by the state in about 10 years, and that has 4 particular areas of emphasis. But in the meantime, I've brought focus to the fact that our current cost spikes in electricity are due to constraints in natural gas supply. So we brought focus among the New England governors to that issue, and because of our actions, we now have 2 private sector proposals to, in the near future, bring more natural gas capacity to the state. Then our energy strategy also talks about more energy efficiency, more investment in small-scale clean energy, and a more reliable and flexible grid. I oppose the Northern Pass as it is proposed. I believe it is possible to have transmission through this state, much more of it underground, that protects our natural places and our tourism industry, our second largest industry. And I know that any plan that comes to our state also needs to have benefits for New Hampshire ratepayers.
And just to stay on that for 30 more seconds, if you believe the utilities, the cost of burying those lines for Northern Pass is very, very significant, which of course would appear in our rates. So is there really any sense that Northern Pass is going to reduce costs associated with electricity, even if it went through with the burying of the lines?
Well, certainly when I called on Northern Pass over a year ago to be more innovative in the transmission side of their business, as businesses are innovative everywhere, it was because I'm seeing other private proposals to underground this kind of transmission in the Northeast, and other businesses are finding affordable ways to do it. So I think the energy industry, which spends such little amount on research and development, needs to innovate in this area as well. And I believe strongly that Northern Pass, we can come to a win-win, but it needs to be something that respects our siting requirements in New Hampshire, our beautiful places, and the wishes of our local communities and citizens, and they need to continue to engage with them. I've sent them back to the drawing board and said, go talk to the people of New Hampshire. We can figure this out.
Thank you. And Walt Havenstein, both the issue of cost of electricity primarily, and then the specifics of Northern Pass, please take a full 90 seconds for that.
Sure. Oh my gosh.
If you need it. If you need it.
I oppose Northern Pass for many of the same reasons the governor opposes Northern Pass, but one reason probably a little different. I've met with Bill Quinlan. I actually know the difference between a decibel and a dumbbell. And I've said, Bill, you haven't shown me that it's technically unachievable to bury these lines. The question of affordability is how you structure the capital recovery. Right? But first and foremost, let's make sure we're being honest with each other about what's achievable and move forward in that direction. I will not support transmission lines, any project that supports transmission lines in the North Country. I won't do it. Second thing, we do need more natural gas into our region. We need more transportation of it. We need more transportation of propane, not just to the industrial users and generators, but to individual homeowners. And we need to encourage that investment in our state. I oppose wind turbines. I oppose wind turbines, but frankly, because they are not efficient and effective in lowering the cost to ratepayers. I was the largest user of electricity, private user of electricity in the state. I was doing a lot of my own cogeneration of BA systems to make sure that we had reliable energy, reliable power. I couldn't afford to be offline for 4 hours. So I know what it means to be efficient and how to save every single penny. That's very important, but we need more capacity. And hydroelectric is the cheapest form of electricity, clean electricity, that we can get. We've got to find a way to make it work for New Hampshire.
Thank you. I have a a few short, or at least I hope short answer questions. One I'm just going to read. I don't usually do that, but I'm going to read it because I will mess it up otherwise. So 30 seconds, Walt Havenstein. If elected governor, would you be willing to support a reliable state revenue source held in trust to fund public aid for water and sewer infrastructure projects?
Well, I do believe that water and sewer infrastructure projects are important, especially to this region. They've been underfunded over the years. But I'm going to tell you, before I look to add a new tax, I'm going to look to make sure we're using every tax dollar we currently have as efficiently as possible and make sure we're making the proper choices around expending those resources.
Maggie Hassan, could you answer the question about water and sewer funding?
Well, it's certainly important, and in our bipartisan budget that we passed without an income or sales tax, we actually did find a way to fund deferred and delayed water projects that had been unfunded in the last budget. So it's very important. We need to continue it. In the state Senate, I also worked to develop a mechanism by which local communities can come together and do regional water and sewer infrastructure if that makes sense to them. And I think that has great promise too.
Thank you. Maggie Hassan, is there anything you could do to reduce the incidence of Lyme disease as governor of New Hampshire, other than staying indoors all the time?
Well, and certainly my sympathies go out to the people who suffer from Lyme disease. We have a very high rate in New Hampshire, and it's a very dreadful disease. And one of the things we know we need to do is make sure that the public is aware of ways that they can avoid being bitten by a tick, and then look out, if they happen to be, for the signs of early Lyme disease. And we continue with our public health department to build that kind of awareness and public education, because prevention is the best way to treat Lyme disease. We also know that our changing climate is changing conditions and making some scientists believe possibly the reason for increased incidence of the disease, and we'll continue to work together on climate change issues throughout the state of New Hampshire.
Walt Havenstein, Lyme disease?
I got to tell you, I know a lot of people with that dreaded disease, including my brother, and so I'm sympathetic. But I haven't given a lot of thought beyond the education and public health notifications for self-awareness that I would take any specific action or propose any specific action. I'd certainly consider it because I do believe it's a dreaded disease and it affects a member of my family.
Thank you. And if you could comment in 30 seconds, Walt Havenstein, with regard to your position on the new voter ID law here in New Hampshire, requiring voters to show their IDs, whether you believe it's necessary and whether you believe the law is appropriate.
I believe the law is appropriate. I believe it's necessary. Just stand by some of our polling offices on the 4th, especially in the northern part of our southern part of our state, and you'll see examples, frankly, of voter fraud. And the Secretary of State has admitted there's voter fraud in our state. We need to make sure our voting system, our democracy, has integrity. You have to show an ID to pick up a pill. Why wouldn't we ask somebody to show an ID to vote? To vote.
Thank you. Maggie Hassan?
Thank you for the question. Our right to vote is the most fundamental right that we have. It is what we have fought for our entire history as a country. And I think it is really important that the integrity of the ballot box and the integrity of our voting places be protected. But I also think it's really important that we don't discourage people from voting. Our Attorney General has investigated repeated charges of so-called voter fraud and has found only about one in about the last 10 years, a young 17-year-old who used his father's license, I think, to vote for President Bush about a decade ago. So let's think about what this is really like. So I have a son who happens to use a wheelchair. He doesn't have a driver's license. He will never drive. In order for him to vote under some of these laws, he would have to be driven to the Department of Motor Vehicles to get an ID he doesn't need in any other way. even though everybody in his community knows who he is, and even though we can attest to who he is. That discourages people from voting. And at a time when we need more people to vote, more people to engage in the process, telling them they have to go through administrative hurdle after administrative hurdle to do it doesn't make sense to me in a state that has some of the best voter protections in the world.
Thank you.
Seriously.
30 more seconds.
You think we don't have a voter problem in this state, voter ID problem? We do.
Let's listen to the candidate. Perhaps could you
And if we
provide a
want to
specific
get more
example?
efficient to make sure people can get IDs, I support that. I support that for everybody. But we do have a voter identification issue here and a voter integrity issue. And it is important, because it is so fundamental to our democracy, that we make sure that process has integrity.
Thank you. That's an emotional issue. To take the emotion out of it, if I walk through your home, Walt Havenstein, would I see more light bulbs that were incandescent or fluorescent?
Gee, it's such a short walk. Let me think. Incandescent.
Thank you. Maggie Hassan?
Incandescent.
Okay. All right, we're not as green as we want to be over here.
Where are the diodes?
Well, no, and I did not offer LEDs
Did
as,
you
as an
offer
option.
LEDs?
Yes, you did
Oh,
not
by the
offer
way, get them
LEDs.
at usfirst.com. Thank you.
Maggie Hassan, New Hampshire has no state-specific minimum wage law at this point. We rely on the federal minimum wage at $7.25. Do you support a change to the minimum wage law? And if so, how do you balance the issue of increasing levels of pay and perhaps reducing availability of lower-paid jobs?
To truly accelerate economic growth, we need to make sure that our working families have a sense of financial security themselves and can afford to buy the goods and services that so many of our small businesses produce. And so it's very important that they make sure that when they're working 40 hours a week or more, that they can actually afford basics. And right now, New Hampshire doesn't have its own minimum wage. We rely on the federal minimum wage. I think it's important to restore it and to improve it. I had a small business person up, I think we were in Dover at a Chamber of Commerce meeting recently, who got up and said, people can't afford to live on the federal minimum wage in this part of the country, and it makes sense to make sure that our working families have that kind of buying power so that the ripple effect of that is spread throughout our economy. So I support restoring it and improving it.
Thank you. Walt Havenstein, the minimum wage.
I don't know exactly what restoring means. We have a minimum wage in the states, the federal minimum wage. I do not support increasing that minimum wage because it's a job killer, entry-level job killer, especially for young people who are trying to enter the market. It is also for many small businesses a crippler in terms of making that very next hire if we were to increase the minimum wage. I support making sure all our citizens have opportunities for economic success. That's what my economic development plan is all about. It doesn't start with, gee, how do we help just the minimum wage for people? It's how do we help everybody by creating an environment where high-paying, sustaining jobs can be created. The opportunities, frankly, that Judy and I saw when we came here, when our son followed us here 15 years ago when he graduated from college. Unfortunately, those opportunities aren't here today. And that's one of the reasons he left 15 months ago and was captured by the economic engine of Texas and Rick Perry. We can do so much better in the context of providing opportunities, an opportunity economy that raises the prospects for everybody.
Thank you. We have lost our 4-year-old attendee here at this event, and I think we've gotten our money's worth out of both our candidates. So I'm going to ask our candidates to provide us with their closing statements, and I'm going to start with Maggie Hassan. 1 minute, please.
Well, thank you very much to the council for hosting us, and to George for moderating, and to Walt for participating. As you can see, there is a clear choice in this election. By working with Republicans and Democrats and independents, we've made progress to expand middle-class opportunity and support innovative businesses so that they can create great jobs right here in New Hampshire. Together, we have put New Hampshire back on the right track, and we've come too far to be dragged backwards to the O'Brien and Koch brother years that devastated our state. Working together, we've set in motion an innovation plan that is strengthening the foundation of our 21st century economy. But we need to continue to keep our economy moving forward, so we need to continue to make higher education and healthcare more affordable and accessible. We need to continue to work to reduce the cost of energy for families and businesses, helping innovative businesses start up in New Hampshire and making it easier for our existing companies to grow. And we need to expand opportunity by restoring and improving the minimum wage. We have more work to do, but I know that if we roll up our sleeves and do it in the New Hampshire way, we'll be able to keep moving in the right direction towards a brighter and even better Granite State future. I'd be honored to have your vote. Thank you.
Thank you, and please, yes. Thank you, Walt Havenstein.
Well, thanks, George. This has been a treat. This is our 7th debate. They're all fun, Governor, and I can't wait for the next one. But I agree with the Governor, there is a choice to be made here, and the distinctions are stark. One is failed leadership when it comes to economic growth. 1.1, 0.9, headed in the wrong direction. More and more of our young people leaving the state. We can't afford that. The demographics is a death spiral for this state. That's why I proposed the Economic Development Plan to create 25,000 private sector jobs in 2.5 years, based upon making New Hampshire once again economically competitive in our region. You don't need to go to Turkey. We need to get to business right here in New England first. Once we restore that economic advantage, I'll be out there selling, just like Rick Perry. I would appreciate your vote on the 4th of November, and when you do, we will start in the direction of putting New Hampshire back on top. Thank you all very, very much.
Just to further differentiate us from those crummy people at WMUR, we actually give these folks a gift when they come here to do this, so they'll come back here again. Thank you all very much, and a round of applause for the Economic Counselor for doing this.
Yes, absolutely.
You get a nice certificate too.
There's one for each.
And there's one for each of you. Well, thank you so much for doing this. Enjoy that. This is fun for us. We appreciate it.
I'm Scotty Mallett with the Bartlett Roundhouse Preservation Club, and we're looking to restore the old Bartlett Roundhouse in Bartlett, New Hampshire. If you'd like more information, you can contact us via our website at www.bartlettroundhouse.org.
This is CCTV, Conway Community Television.